Some sounds, they don't need to be loud to stay with you. Sometimes they just settle in. Where are you tonight? And what time is it where you are? Leave it in the comments. Just remember this moment. You'll want to know exactly where you were when it began. There had been many strange things remembered from childhood, but few had left such a lingering feeling of unease. The incident, whether real or dreamed, had returned often in restless sleep, vivid and unshakable, even with the passage of years. Back when school involved sticky desks and backpacks stuffed with broken pencils, a small family had been settled in a sprawling apartment complex nestled between two highways. The buildings had been arranged in horseshoe fashion, creating a courtyard surrounded by balconies, laundry lines, and the occasional potted plant left forgotten. The child had lived with both parents, neither negligent nor cruel, simply tired. The mother had worked long shifts behind a supermarket register, her name embroidered in pale blue on a polyester vest. The father, a gas station attendant with perpetually stained hands, had worked erratic night hours. There had been affection in the home, nonetheless, lazy movie nights with buttery popcorn, mornings spent watching cartoons with a groggy father, and the excitement of holiday mornings marked by reused decorations. The father's sleep schedule had meant shared mornings and quiet, tired dinners. The child had often sat beside him, crunching cereal while he watched the weather forecast, then spent evenings winding down beside both parents on their sunken sofa. The most prominent feature of the neighborhood had been the asphalt court, a stretch of blacktop that to a small child had seemed as vast as a football field. It had started just outside Building D and curved around toward the row of industrial dumpsters near the service entrance. In the child's eyes, it had been a place of endless potential, a racetrack, a game board, a blank canvas. Most afternoons, a small group of neighborhood children had gathered there. Boxes of faded chalk had been prized possessions, and the games played had changed daily: hopscotch, obstacle courses, cartoon murals. The asphalt had belonged to them, transformed with each passing hour into something new. It had been on one such afternoon that something unusual had been spotted while walking back from the school bus stop. The child had noticed a sagging cardboard box, partially submerged in a roadside ditch, bloated with rainwater. A stick had been retrieved from under a bush, and the box had been carefully poked toward dry ground. The top had caved in easily, and inside had been a surprise chalk. Not the stubby, colorful kind that usually came in birthday sets, but pale, bone-white school chalk, the kind used on classroom blackboards. The box had been nearly destroyed, but the sticks inside had been pristine. If damp, they had been gathered up eagerly and cradled like treasure. The others had emerged from their own apartments just as the chalk had been presented. There had been cheering, and then the rapid-fire planning that children defaulted to. The names had been different then: Colin, Jessa, Malik, Tamara, Ruby, Theo, and Anna, but the eagerness had been the same. Each child had received 2 pieces of chalk. 2 had remained, placed aside in case any broke. No one had wanted to risk wasting them. They had split up quickly, some starting on games, others laying out a story across the warm pavement. The drawings had sprawled across the court, weaving past each other in the way childhood drawings often did, strange, whimsical, and unbothered by rules. A cool breeze had blown across the blacktop, but the concrete had still held the midday heat. The children had sprawled across it nonetheless, shaded by the branches of a tall elm tree that leaned over the court. Cartoon creatures had begun to take shape: dragons with toothy grins, awkward superheroes, odd little stick figure animals. Some drawings had been beautiful in their simplicity. Others had been clumsy but full of imagination. Time had blurred as it often did at that age. The minutes had melted together in the heat, laughter drifting up into the open air, unanswered by any adult voice. Farther down the court, the older boys had built a simple obstacle course, marked with spirals and jagged paths. Shoes had scuffed lines into the black top as they raced, timed by one of the others with a plastic digital watch. In the quieter corner near the tree, two girls had drawn a massive hopscotch board, wide, uneven, and slowly taking over the corner of the court. No one had noticed anything wrong until much later. The sun had dipped just far enough to throw long shadows across the pavement when the first disappearance had occurred. It had not been seen, only heard. A stone had been tossed casually, the sharp clack of it hitting pavement echoing slightly. Then the rapid thuds of footsteps. 1, 2, 3, 4, then silence. A soft voice had spoken a name. Confusion had spread quickly. The girl who had been hopping had simply vanished. The others had looked around, expecting to see her crouched in laughter or hiding in jest. But no such trick had been played. She was gone. Luca. A suggestion had been made that she had returned home, but it hadn't felt right. The girl's sister had been sent to check. She had left reluctantly, and the others had resumed their games, hesitant, but unconvinced of any real danger. Soon after, one of the boys had collapsed onto the pavement in theatrical exhaustion. This had sparked the idea to draw chalk outlines, like those seen in crime shows. The first outline had been traced, the chalk gliding strangely easily over the hot concrete. As the outline had neared completion, the chalk hadn't even shown signs of wear. That detail had stuck in memory, the eerie persistence of the chalk, like it had been untouched by the ground. Another child had volunteered to be next. He had begun to lay down near the first outline, then jumped back up with a yelp, complaining the concrete was too hot. He had been searching for a cooler spot when the incident occurred. As the artist had stepped back to admire the outline, the boy lying inside it had begun to sit up, only to vanish, as if sucked down through the ground. No flash, no noise, just a sudden, seamless disappearance. A small depression had remained in the chalk outline, but nothing else. Panic had bloomed. There had been a moment of paralyzing confusion, a gaping silence that stretched too long. The girl who had done the drawing had fallen backward in disbelief, and then had stood in a rush, bolting toward home with her breath catching in her throat. The others had called out to her, but their voices had not reached her ears fully. She had been focused on one thing: reaching the apartment door, the perceived safety behind it. Once inside, she had locked herself in her room, sitting beneath the window with her knees pulled to her chest. Her heartbeat had thundered in her ears. Dinner had come and gone in a blur. Her mother had noticed the strange mood, the silence where there had usually been stories, but no explanation had been given. When asked to take out the trash after dinner, she had hesitated. The dumpster had been on the far side of the court. That blacktop now felt like forbidden ground, but refusal would have raised suspicion. The bag had been grabbed, and she had stepped into the darkening courtyard with dread trailing behind her like a shadow. The blacktop had changed. It had once felt warm and familiar beneath sneakers and bare feet, a playground of safety and laughter. But that night, it had stretched before her like something endless and cold, a black river that threatened to swallow sound. The street lamps had offered only dim consolation, casting thin halos of light near the parking lot. The rest of the court had remained cloaked in shadow. No porch lights had been visible. No adult voices had echoed. The complex had fallen into that strange liminal state that only occurred after dusk, when everything familiar became alien. The bag in her hand had crinkled with every step. Her shoes had scuffed the pavement softly, the only sound other than her quickened breath. She had passed the corner where earlier the hopscotch board had been drawn, now half swallowed by shadow. Beyond it had lain the section where cartoon figures had been scrawled, their outlines faint in the darkness, but still visible enough to bring a fresh wave of nausea. They had looked different now. Lines that had once been cheerful and jagged had become crooked and stretched. Figures had appeared warped under the slanted light, their chalky eyes peering upward in ways they hadn't before. One creature, vaguely resembling a lizard, had seemed to lean slightly in her direction. Another, a smiling robot, had bent oddly at the joints, its arm unnaturally long. She had kept walking, her eyes fixed ahead, her pace increasing. The outline of the vanished boy had been avoided. It had still been there, unmistakable even from a distance. The chalk hadn't been disturbed. No child had smeared it. No rain had fallen to wash it away. It had remained too perfect, untouched and unnatural. The dumpster had been reached quickly. The bag had been thrown in without ceremony, the heavy lid thudding closed. But the worst part had come on the way back. The cord had felt longer on the return. The air had hung thick and unmoving, and her own footsteps had seemed unnaturally loud. The chalk drawings had not been where she'd remembered. They had shifted. Where once the trail of cartoon characters had curved to the left near the basketball hoop, it now twisted toward the center. The robot had moved. It had stood farther back. Now it was near the tree, and worse, the drawings had seemed to move. Not quickly, and not overtly, but the more she had stared at them, the more the suggestion of movement had become undeniable. A hand had lifted slightly. A tail had dragged faintly behind a chalk dragon. They had moved the way heat moves the air on scorching days, slow bending, impossible to grasp directly. She had broken into a run. The edge of the court had been in sight when she tripped. A foot had caught the edge of the hopscotch board, and her balance had faltered. She had fallen forward, knees scraping the pavement. Her elbow had struck hard, and she'd hissed through clenched teeth. But the pain had not been what stopped her breath. Her foot had dipped into the pavement, not scraped, not bounced. It had sunk. The square she'd stepped in had rippled. Her sneaker had been swallowed up to the ankle, as if she'd landed in thick mud. There had been a terrible second, where the foot had remained submerged. She had stared, panic rising like bile, until the foot had finally pulled free with a faint sucking sound. Tears had sprung unbidden. She had scrambled back, crawling a few feet before managing to stand. From there she had sprinted. The chalk creatures had lunged, or seemed to, their limbs now unmistakably reeked. The dinosaur had turned its head slightly. The smile on the robot had stretched wider, but they had been slow, too slow. Her fear had kept her faster than them. As she had passed the outline once again, a sound had emerged. Not a voice, not a word, just a soft shuddering sob so low it could have been mistaken for the wind. The apartment door had burst open at her touch. She had thrown herself inside, sobbing and screaming, calling for her mother with the kind of terror that didn't care about consequences. Her mother had rushed over, arms wrapping tight, warmth meeting cold skin. Questions had been asked, frantic, worried, but none had been answered. Words hadn't worked. The father, pale and unwell, had stepped out from the darkened bedroom. His eyes had registered alarm, but he'd been too unsteady to help. The mother had guided her child to bed, whispering nonsense words in a soothing rhythm, brushing hair back from a sweaty forehead. Dinner had gone untouched. The child had lain stiff under the covers, eyes wide in the darkness, staring at the ceiling as the images from the court continued to loop in the mind. Later that night, a phone call had arrived. It had come from the mother of the vanished boy. Her voice had carried through the thin apartment walls, soft but tight with worry. The boy hadn't returned home. No one had seen him. The apartment complex had grown smaller in that moment, the walls closing in, the hallway darker. The child had curled tighter beneath the sheets. The words being spoken had confirmed what had already been feared. Morning had come with the wail of sirens. Uniformed officers had fanned across the grounds, knocking on doors, asking questions. Yellow tape had been unfurled near the dumpster. A clipboard had been carried by one of the detectives, and photographs had been taken of the court. But something had changed overnight. All the chalk had disappeared. Not faded, not smudged, gone. The rain hadn't fallen. No sprinkler had been left on. The weather had remained dry, yet every trace of chalk had been erased. The characters, the hopscotch board, the obstacle course, all of it had vanished. Even the outline, where the boy had dropped into the pavement, had disappeared. The maintenance staff had claimed ignorance. No one had been ordered to clean the area. No hoses had been used. The court had looked freshly paved. A statement had been taken. The child had described the events truthfully, or as truthfully as memory allowed. But when asked again and again, the child had repeated only what could be said without sounding mad. The boy had been there. The girl had been there. Then they hadn't. The detectives had scribbled notes. Polite nods had been given. Then they had moved on. No one had found a clue. The days that followed had felt like a suspended breath. The police presence had slowly faded after 48 hours of fruitless searching. Flyers had been posted at nearby intersections. Photos of two smiling children printed on paper that fluttered restlessly in the breeze. Cars had passed without slowing. Pedestrians had glanced without stopping. In the apartment complex, a quiet tension had settled. Doors had remained closed. Parents had pulled children indoors earlier than usual. Conversations had been whispered. Glances exchanged with worry. The blacktop had remained untouched, as though all had silently agreed not to step foot on it again. The child had watched from the window, face pressed against the glass, eyes fixed on the court below. No one had gone near it, not even the younger residents, who normally disobeyed rules with defiant ease. The drawings had not returned. No new chalk lines had been added. The surface had remained blank, too blank. The mother had tried to maintain routine. School lunches had been packed. Homework had been supervised. But the glances had been more frequent, the hand resting on the child's forehead more often. The father, still recovering from a short illness, had returned to work the following week. His nights had resumed their usual rhythm of absence, and his presence during the day had grown more distant, as if something unnamed had begun to eat away at his usual calm. A week had passed, then 2, then 3. The search had been officially suspended. Investigators had referred to a lack of leads and uncooperative witnesses. The implication had not been subtle. The families of the missing children had not been seen often after that. The girl's mother, Ruby's mother, had taken to sitting alone on the concrete steps during late afternoons, staring blankly toward the court with a cigarette trembling between her fingers. Theo's parents had moved out before the end of the month. Their lease had not been renewed. No explanation had been offered. By the time autumn had arrived, the child's own parents had begun discussing a move. The conversations had been had in hushed tones, late at night, but walls in those apartments had been thin. The child had heard everything. A new job had been offered, a better school district, fewer incidents in the area. It had all sounded so logical, but it had never been about logic. It had been about that asphalt court, about the eyes that had watched from chalk lines, about the strange depression in the pavement where the boy had vanished, about the drawings that had seemed to breathe. The packing had begun in October. Books had been boxed, closets had been emptied. The child had been told that new adventures awaited in a better neighborhood, with a park nearby, that school would be better, that it would all feel new and exciting. But nothing had felt exciting. The final week in the old apartment had brought a deepening of dread, because something had begun to change again. It had started subtly, bare outlines on the court, visible only in early morning light, a single square, a faded spiral, a partial sketch of something resembling a flower. Then more. Every morning a little more had appeared. No one had drawn them. No one had been seen carrying chalk. No rain had fallen to suggest wash-away illusions. The drawings had simply been there, returning, rebuilding. The child had stopped sleeping. Dreams had returned, vivid and oppressive. In one, a long hopscotch path had stretched across an endless black landscape, lit by a sun that never moved. Each jump had pulled the dream self deeper into the ground, slower each time, until only fingertips had remained above the surface. In another, outlines of laughing children had gathered at the edges of the court, their eyes hollow, their smiles unmoving, their limbs caught in eternal mid-motion. In all of them, the chalk had glowed, not brightly, but steadily, like something alive. The last night in the apartment had been restless. Boxes had filled the hallway. The moving truck had been scheduled for early morning. The mother had already gone to bed, exhausted from sorting and taping. But the child had not gone to sleep. A voice had been heard. It had come through the wall. Not a word, just a familiar cry. A single sound, muffled, weak, unmistakable. The sob from the outline. From that spot, the child had sat upright. Eyes had fixed on the window. The curtains had been drawn back slowly, and there it had been, the court, but not empty. Shapes had been visible. They had been chalk outlines at first, faint, but moving, just barely. The child had stared, and then, as if called, had stood. The apartment door had been opened without sound. Bare feet had touched cool linoleum, then concrete, then asphalt. The court had felt colder than ever before. The air had been completely still. At the center, the drawings had been back, more than before. A hopscotch board, nearly identical to the one from that awful afternoon, had stretched diagonally across the space. Around it, cartoon creatures had reappeared, their limbs twisted in ways that hadn't existed before. Some had looked unfinished. Others had seemed distorted, smeared at the edges like smudged fingerprints. And in the center of it all, the outline, the original one, the one that had vanished weeks ago. The chalk around it had thickened, grown denser, whiter, and then the voice had been heard again. A whisper, a whimper. No direction could be placed on it. It had been all around. The child had approached the outline. The moment the edge had been crossed, a weightless feeling had set in, like gravity had shifted, like the court had tilted ever so slightly inward. The chalk beneath bare feet had seemed to glow faintly. Each step had made it pulse, dim, then bright, then dim again. And then the shadow had moved. Not the child's, one of the drawn figures. Something resembling a rabbit with jagged arms had twitched. Then another, a cat with missing eyes. Its head had turned. The child had frozen. The drawings had begun to shift. Slowly, softly. The court had started to breathe. The court had breathed again. Not metaphorically, but with a slow, unmistakable pulse, like a living surface beneath the child's feet. The black top had no longer felt solid. Something beneath it had moved, deep and rhythmic, like the chest of a sleeping creature. The chalk outlines had responded. Shapes once frozen had now begun to animate. Their movements had been sluggish but purposeful, arms stretching, heads tilting, eyes reorienting toward the intruder in their midst. None had spoken, no voices had called out, but their intentions had been understood. The child had stepped back, only to find the hopscotch board behind, now longer than before, stretching impossibly across the court. A sudden realization had pierced through the haze of fear. The drawings had not been made for fun. They had been traps. Every spiral, every square, every smiling face, tools of invitation, paths drawn for small hands to follow, to trace, to inhabit. The outline of Theo had glowed brightest. Its lines had become bold and raised, the chalk thickening like veins. From within that outline, the same soft sob had echoed again, clearer now. It hadn't been coming from the drawing, it had been coming through it. A trembling step had been taken forward, and in response, the entire court had shimmered. Not just one spot, not just the outline, all of it, as though the entire surface had been covered in a thin skin of tension. now reacting to the presence of one who had witnessed before, who had escaped once and returned. The child had wanted to run. Every fiber had screamed for flight, but the feet had stayed planted. And then it had happened again. The ground beneath had softened. A square of hopscotch near the child's left foot had rippled. Something from below had pushed upward, a faint bulge rising under the asphalt like a hand pressing against fabric. Another sob, this time from below. The image of Ruby had flashed behind closed eyes, her jumping feet, her sudden absence, the drawn grid where she'd last stood. The truth had landed heavy and unbearable. They had not disappeared. They had been taken, not by a person, not by a creature, by the chalk, by the court, by whatever force had dwelt just below the surface, feeding off imagination, invitation, innocence. The chalk had been the medium, the drawings had been the bait, and the children, in their joy and wonder, had made the perfect doorway. A low creak had echoed across the court as another figure shifted, this one almost familiar, with soft edges and half-erased eyes. It had resembled a child, crouched and weeping, its form only partially drawn. The court had begun to tilt slightly inward again. More hands had reached up from chalk outlines. Fingers had uncurled from jagged spirals. Something had whispered in a tone not made for human ears, and the shapes had answered, twitching in unison. The child had turned to run, but the path had changed again. What had once been a straight shot to the apartment complex had twisted sideways. The perimeter of the court had warped, as though the blacktop now extended far beyond its original edges, warping the world around it. There had been no end in sight, only chalk, only darkness, only the low, humming sound of something ancient and hungry. Every drawing had now turned toward the fleeing figure. The dinosaur had opened its mouth wider. The robot had begun to stand. The hopscotch board had pulsed beneath each running step like a beating heart. The child had run faster than ever before, lungs burning, limbs trembling. The edge had been in sight, a flicker of a staircase, the dull orange glow of a hallway light. Behind the court had writhed, and then a leap, a desperate wild jump over the largest chalk outline yet, drawn like a yawning pit, its shape impossible to fully comprehend. The feet had cleared it, barely. The sound of chalk snapping had echoed behind. The apartment building had been reached, the door yanked open with all remaining strength. The stairs had been taken two at a time. The hallway had stretched, impossibly long, but the apartment door had finally come into reach. The knob had turned, the room had been entered, and the breath had been released. Safety had returned, temporary and trembling. The child had collapsed inside, sobbing, calling for the mother with a voice nearly gone from screaming. This time, the story had been told, every word, every detail. The mother had listened, at first with confusion, then with fear, then with a silence that spoke of a truth she couldn't fully name but somehow believed. That night, the decision had been made. The move had been accelerated. Before the next sunrise, the family had packed what they could and left Briar Court for good. No one had ever returned. Years had passed. The child had become an adult. The memories dulled but not erased. The dreams had returned often. Each time the court had appeared in sleep, it had been longer, wider. The drawings had always been there, half-formed, whispering. Sometimes, outlines had been drawn in public parks and schoolyards. No one had seen who made them. Children had gathered, and sometimes, children had disappeared. The house had been built by hand, nails driven in with purpose, wood sanded smooth by calloused palms, a lifetime etched into walls. One board at a time, it had stood for 46 years, long enough to remember peace, long enough to forget what silence meant. It had begun again on a Monday. The clock had struck 8:07 p.m. The air had been still. Inside, an old man had sat in his favorite chair, a throne softened by age, creased with sweat and stories. Beside him, a woman, thin-lipped, sharp-eyed, had muttered about the game show. The light had flickered once, then the smoke had arrived. Not thick, not immediate, but creeping, slithering through the vents like a memory not invited. The bell had rung, not once, not twice, but 3 times, measured, precise. The old man had risen, underwear clinging to skin softened by years, boots slapped on with urgency, robe forgotten. The door had been opened with a grunt, and the fire had waited, not accidental, not wild, contained, structured. A paper bag, thick and soaked, had stood surrounded by flame, a ritualistic little crown atop the concrete. It had been stomped as expected, as always, and inside, excrement, foul, warm, fresh, but this time, different. The smell had not lifted with the flames. It had lingered, too thick, too earthy, from the bushes. Laughter, but not light, not youthful, something off, throaty, wet. Break words had been shouted, threats carved into the night air with cracked vocal cords, but the figures had vanished, or had they ever stood there at all? No footprints had been found, no rustling leaves, only the heat left in the soil. The remaining embers had been brushed aside. A smear of waste on the man's boot had clung like glue. Inside, the woman had continued muttering, unconcerned, as if nothing had changed, as if the show were still playing, but the TV had shown only static, and outside, at the edge of the lawn, something had watched, something tall, still, bent slightly at the neck. It had not moved, it had not blinked, just waited. Long break. The police had been called. A voice had answered, monotone, bored. A suggestion had been made. Cameras. Useless, the man had thought. He had said so. He had not known how to use one. He had not known how to look back. No report had been taken. No notes had been written. The old man had hung up, and in that instant, the house had grown cold, not from the season, but from within. The boot had remained by the door. Its sole had been scrubbed, but the stain had not lifted. A dull smear, stubborn and alive, seemed to pulse faintly in the daylight. Outside, the porch boards had creaked more than usual, not from weather, not from age, but from weight, something stepping lightly, where no steps had been made. Each night had arrived with a different gift, sometimes a bag, sometimes a jar, once a cage, empty, but still rattling. Each had been left burning, always centered, always deliberate. Breath. Inside, the woman had stopped responding. Her voice had faded to whispers. She had begun watching the TV long after it had been turned off. Her fingers had traced patterns on the arm of her chair, spirals that didn't repeat. When asked a question, she had looked toward the window, not out it, but toward it, as if something on the glass had spoken before she could. The smell had worsened, not just rot, not just smoke, but damp, like river mud, dragged through old wood. The walls had begun to darken in patches. Gray spores had bloomed in corners, but no rain had come, and the roof had remained intact. Break. At 2:13 a.m., something had scratched the back door. Not a knock, not claws, nails, slow, insistent, from bottom to top, then side to side. Measuring the frame, the man had stayed in his chair, boots on, eyes open. The sound had stopped after 40 seconds, but the wet footprints had remained on the mat until morning. No source, no trail, only prints that led inward. Long break. The local hardware store had delivered a motion light. It had been installed on the porch, 4 screws, 2 wires. That night, it had turned on 4 times. Each time, the porch had appeared empty. On the 5th, it had shorted out, melted from the inside. The plastic housing had run like wax, dripping onto the first step, and there, in the pooling resin, another gift had been left, a glove, leather, charred, still warm, inside it, dirt, black and grainy, mixed with strands of hair. The man had buried it, not far, just behind the shed. Breath. The next day, the footprints had reappeared, but this time, they had gone up the wall. The house had begun to creak, even when no one moved. The hallway had shortened. The kitchen light had begun to flicker in patterns, measured, almost breathing. The woman had stopped eating. She had sat still in her chair, hands curled, whispering to something only she could see in the reflection of the darkened screen. Outside, the grass had yellowed in perfect circles, as if marked, as if drained. The air had grown thick. Even fans had moved slower. Time itself had taken on a humid, dragging weight. Breath. At 3:33 a.m., the boards beneath the bed had lifted slightly, only for a moment, then lowered. Nothing had been found underneath. No mouse, no air duct, but a voice had been heard in the pipes. It had not spoken words, just laughter, but slow and wet and full of mucus. The gifts had returned, each more specific than the last. A doll made from hair, stitched together with black twine. A coin polished to a mirror shine, with a hole drilled perfectly in the center. A bundle of feathers glued together with teeth. All burned, all left, smoldering on the porch, all smelling of salt and clay, and something that should not have been dug up. The man had begun to board the windows, but the boards had warped. Every nail he had driven had bent before finishing its path, and still the footsteps had walked above him at night. Even when he lay awake, even when he stared at the ceiling, something had walked directly over his chest, step by step, without pressure, but with presence. Long break. The woman had vanished during a thunderstorm. No sound, no struggle, just her robe, found in a perfect spiral on the basement floor, and a single smear of mud. No footprints, just one long finger dragging outward toward the storm drain. That night, the house had whispered, not creaked, not groaned, whispered. A new name had been repeated, over and over. Not his name, not hers, one they had never spoken aloud, and it had been repeated through the walls in different voices each time. Low, childlike, old, dry, clicking. He had listened, and by dawn, the walls had begun to peel. The final gift had arrived at dawn, not on the porch, not by the steps, but inside, placed carefully at the center of the living room rug, still smoking. A box, carved from pale wood, etched with spiral marks, the same spirals the woman had once traced. Its lid had been cracked open, and inside, the boot, his boot, the same one he had worn that first night, weeks ago, stained with flame and filth, now returned, impossibly clean, but wrong. The laces were tied in a way no one could explain, and something ticked inside it. Breath. The man had backed away, but the walls had pulsed. The windows had clouded. The house had closed, locked from the inside. The temperature had dropped. A fine mist had rolled down the staircase. The floorboards had wept condensation. Then a knock, not at the front, not at the back, but from beneath. A hollow rapping on the floor itself, from the crawl space, from under the rug, from the ground. When he had lifted the rug, the hardwood had already been pried up, a perfect circle, carved clean. The space below had not existed before. He had known every inch of that foundation, but now there had been a tunnel, lined with bricks older than the house, wetted with something between oil and blood, and echoing faintly with the sound of something chewing. He had stood at the edge, breath fogging, pulse slowing, and then he had dropped, voluntarily, not tripping, not pulled, just surrendered. Long break. The house had gone still. The air had become clean again. The walls had stopped creaking. No more gifts had appeared. Neighbors had commented how quiet the place had become. No more shouting, no more hammering, just stillness. A for sale sign had appeared 2 months later. No one had seen who put it there. No one had seen the man again. No family had claimed the property. Only the boot had remained, sitting in the yard, laces perfectly tied. And sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, a faint burning smell could be caught on the breeze, mixed with the soft sound of footsteps that never really left.